Break the internet here. Okay, welcome everybody to the Practitioners Workshop. This is the week when we look over a book together. We're currently reading God's Companions by Sam Wells. We're on week 2 or part 2 of chapter 7. Last time we met, we spent a lot of quite powerful time sharing about the first section of the chapter about sort of telling the truth of who we are, sinful nature, evil, collusion, the different sort of levels and understanding of how sin works in institutions and individuals. And I thought, Sam, did you want to say a few words about the chapter where you wanted to go, but specifically, you and I discussed looking at sort of the 3 gifts that God gives in responding to evil and sin, namely repentance, forgiveness, and reconciliation.
Yeah, shall I come in at that point? I guess there are, if you remember the previous chapter, the kind of the big reveal in that chapter, once you'd waded through all of the chapter, was that even the enemy is a gift to the church. And there are things the church can be in the face of the enemy that the church couldn't otherwise be. So it's not just God gives the church everything it needs to withstand the enemy, but the enemy is one of the things that God gives the church in order to be everything it needs to be. So there's a similar kind of implied reveal in this chapter, although I don't think I state it. It doesn't get a sort of subheading, so it's not as explicit. And that is the same sort of twofold thing. On the one hand, God gives the church everything it needs in the face of failure, lapse, sin, evil, lack of imagination, all the things that I categorize there. But, it's the same move as in the previous chapter. Those failures are the happy faults that allow so great a redemption to go to the Exultet and the Easter Vigil. They are part of what it means to be church, and there are things that the church can't be unless those failures happen. It's not the same as saying God meant the organist to run off with a associate vicar, But when I ran my improvisation class at Duke Divinity School, one of the assignments was, it becomes known in the community on Friday that the pastor has gone off with the organist. You're the bishop, and you've cancelled your other engagements to go and be with that church on the Sunday. What do you say? And in terms of improvisation, and a lot of this is based on improvisation, really. It's that same move as in theatrical improvisation, that there is no. It's all an offer. It's all an opportunity to discover the gospel, to receive grace, even in the most, disadvantageous circumstances. So, the fundamental disposition is not the PR disposition to say, well, I've heard some interesting things about the local imam. Maybe you ought to go and talk to him. Apparently his wife's not at all happy. Or, there's the classic sort of PR moves of distraction and placing it in a much bigger picture. In all the churches in the States, this is the first time the organist has chosen the pastor to run off with. Usually the organist runs off with a bunch of other people. This has not occurred for the last 13 years, and it's only occurred in 0.1% of parishes. So let's not get this out of, those are the standard press office default settings. But this is an invitation to say, how can this church look back in 10 years' time on this period as a moment when it got rid of the pastor it didn't like. No, sorry, that's not that what you're supposed to say. As the moment when it came together like never before and discovered what it meant to be a church, community of truth telling. And that may involve a bunch of other people that the organist has tried to run off with, or the pastors, got involved with. Goodness knows what else might come out of that. And that's what happens on these occasions. You find that this is the tip of the iceberg in most cases, and it's part of a much bigger story. However, that that doleful experience becomes a point of renewal for the community. So it's the same kind of move as in chapter 6, to say this isn't to be managed. This is to be prayed through. This is to be received as gift. This is a time when you can see, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, according to Leonard Cohen, and his particular kind of gospel. So do you see what I mean? That's the crucial point to make, really, is how can this be a redefining? Sometimes it's a cleansing, and we'll, the Jean Vanier story recently, for example, was was obviously not all about Jean Vanier and his weaknesses, or worse. I mean, some of it was about the desire of the church to have a figurehead on which it projects all its desire for somebody to be perfect. So, some of it's a cleansing, but some of it is more than just a cleansing. Some of it is a discovery of a deeper truth.
That makes me think of the importance in a community, but also spiritually, to be really explicit about enemies. What is an enemy? Jesus tells us to pray for our enemies. But I think that a lot of church, the institutional response is very much in that HR approach, where we what do they say in Harry Potter, that which must not be named. So we sort of like stay away from it. So what power does naming the enemy have in that cleansing?
Well, I've I've done a little bit of work on judgment. In fact, I think I did this. Anyway, I mean, I did a lecture on this in Peterborough last week, about what act justly means, and part of that is working with the word judgment. And it seems to me, judgment, in the popular imagination, judgment is taking your prejudice and adding a little bit of small-mindedness, and then making dismissive remarks, usually about a minority or about somebody who's vulnerable. But if you take, a wider view of judgment, then judgment is a power that you have when you find the truth about somebody, and you can use that power to destroy them or to restore them. And so an enemy is the person that uses the power of judgment to seek to destroy you. You may not feel like that towards them. So it's possible to have an attitude of having no enemies, in the sense that you are not seeking to destroy others. Although it's best not to be self-deceptive. You're better to know you have enemies than to pretend you don't. But nonetheless, you can be a person who has got to a place in their life where they say, I don't believe I have enemies of my choosing, but you can still have an enemy of somebody else's choosing. I was reflecting on leadership with a colleague a day or two ago, and just recognizing that in leadership you have to take decisions which result in unfortunate outcomes for people that may not have been your explicit desire. You're not wanting to destroy them, and they may regard you as an enemy because they place on you all their hostile thoughts and anger about how their life hasn't turned out how they wanted. So that's an example of how someone can regard you as an enemy who who you regard as a former colleague and who you're sad you no longer work with, but you ran out of money or whatever it was that meant that they had to go. So that's so that's a sort of a sense of enemy. To me, it's really about judgment, and it's really about the use of judgment to destroy.
Is there a relational aspect to those two about judgment? Like if we choose to destroy someone, we've elected to not remain in relationship with them, I suppose.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It all comes back to with for me. I mean, no surprises there. Yeah, no, I mean, so judgment is the judgment in that sense. The use of judgment. So the use of judgment to restore is a way of truth telling becoming the enriching of relationship. But judgment in the sense of a judgment that leads to the decision you have to destroy someone is recognizing there is no way you can be in relationship with that person. Now, I think there's a kind of a middle course, and I think it's almost inherently a provisional, temporary middle course. When you are very close to somebody and a third party has done something very, very damaging towards them, say you're the parent of a child who somebody has acted more than improperly towards, shall we say. I think it's, for the period until it's possible to enter into some kind of multi-stage process of reconciliation, then you are more or less an enemy of that person. But again, I would regard that as suspended mercy rather than explicit hostility / destruction. So that would be a. But I mean, I think if we look at a contemporary term, I should say. Well, I meant term, but term is a better word. Privilege. If we look at the word privilege, which is everywhere at the moment, privilege, as I see it, is an undermining of solidarity. Privilege is the state in which you choose to retreat into your isolated advantage rather than take the risk of your vulnerability and solidarity. It may be, it may be something to do your upbringing. It may not be something where you've chosen, but that's where I would locate privilege within. Privilege seems to be need for me to be crying out to be located somewhere. It's just become this word that's often related to race today. And because it's such a powerful word and such a dismissive word, it just leaves people feeling completely trapped and paralyzed. And so I think what people like ourselves need to do is find a location for that word grammatically in relation to the other key words in our theological vocabulary, and I think that's where it belongs. It's an inhibition to solidarity. And if you believe, as I do, that isolation is the fundamental human problem, then you can see how privilege is actually enhancing isolation rather than contributing to solidarity, and that's what's wrong with it.
So in your schema of sin, the privilege would be a perversion of the gifts that we're given, but also a lack of imagination in how to situate that gift.
Yeah, and it's a kind of assertion of one's own assets and an imperviousness to the assets of a particular group of people that you either by accident or design have overlooked, seen as irrelevant, dismissed, those kind of things. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm being tentative about it because I think privilege is used both in a passive sense, as in those who grew up in certain locations with a certain skill color, maybe skin color, so maybe went to certain schools. You know, that kind of there's a passive sense of choices that maybe a young person or a child didn't make. And then there's an active sense of active choices that an individual or a group of people did make, like Jim Crow laws for most obviously.
Mhm.
So I think it can be used rather sweepingly of both of those, and that's where it, its usefulness as a term rather breaks down. But I think the power of the word is that from the person who doesn't have it, there's no real difference between those two. So the person who's accused of it, there's a massive difference. So it's a word that is still finding its proper definition, I think, but it's being used so passionately and so often at the moment that I think this kind of forum is exactly the kind of forum where we need to kind of I've forgotten the grammatical term. We need to parse it.
Yeah.
Need to work out grammatically what it's made up of.
Earlier you mentioned Jean Vanier, sort of a titan of ethical writing and living, and then it being disclosed that he had been in decades of abuse. Also, you use John Howard Yoder a lot in your work, especially in this chapter. Same thing with him.
Well, different thing, but also equally sad.
Yeah. How do we deal with it? I'm especially interested in this idea of sort of parsing out privilege. How do we contend with someone whose thought is so good, so theologically grounded and just good, and their decades of abuse that comes to light, sometimes probably in the full light of at least some of our heroes? You see am I making sense?
You're making a lot of sense. I think everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. And it's a very painful subject. And there are theologically trite answers that deal with it, but of course don't deal with it. So all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God is one of those theologically trite answers, which is obviously scriptural. And another one, not quite so trite, is the Donatist controversy in the early church, in the way that the victorious position was that the Holy Spirit can still work through fallible human hands. So we all know that, but no, I can't remember where it was. I can't remember where it was, but I wrote something that I think it was a lecture, in which but I wrote it, as I sometimes do, a couple of months before I was due to give it, and it included the phrase Jean Vanier, perhaps the holiest man I've ever met, which I then quietly erased before I gave the lecture, and was pretty glad it was a lecture and not something that that was in a book where it couldn't be erased.
Yeah.
So it was I did know him reasonably well, and it was obviously horrifying to discover the realities of a big part of his life. And Yoda is somebody I still cannot disentangle Yoda from my theological view. I was just thinking yesterday, I was writing something that described the world that is all in God's creation, that has taken the freedom of God's patience not yet to believe. I find that such an extraordinarily helpful configuration that I've committed it to memory and used it in many settings. That's Yoda. Nobody else puts it like that. I don't know what to do without a sentence like that, because I don't have a definition for the world that is better than that one. So it's very damaging. It's incredibly damaging, and it's especially damaging for an ethic of virtue. That takes sanctification seriously. This stuff is supposed to make you a better person. So I think the first thing to say is we all know we're not that great personally, deep down, and we still somehow have a habit of expecting of others standards that deep down we don't particularly keep ourselves. The second thing to say is I would be surprised and disappointed if the lives of those on this call were particularly similar to Yoda or Vanier. You know, I mean, these are kind of off the scale moral failings. You know, we've all got things badly wrong in different places. I'm sure we have, but that's big time. I mean, these are really egregious things affecting. I mean, the difference between those, you know, Yoda, we're talking about over 100 women. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Vanier, we're talking about a more restricted number of cases, but to a much more profound degree. I mean, it's facile to use a word like profound when somebody has been so damaged, but you know, over a much longer period of time with a much more profound relationship, as opposed to, you know, what Yoda was engaged in, which wasn't really relationship. So they are different, but I'm not saying one's better than the other. I think they're both pretty awful, and I've said that publicly, and you know, in remarks about the Vanier situation. However, in the end, it is a well, there's two things. Okay, so the first is it's a recognition that this is something that every Christian is possible for every Christian. The second thing is what then. Well, the third, there's probably three levels. The second level is how can somebody who is so good, you know, in so many ways, so eloquent, so wise, and so transformative in community life as Vanier was over such a long period of time, be so bad? You know, that's the second one. And then the third one is, what do we do with their legacy? I mean, what, you know, do we, you know, what I do with Yoda, frankly, is I still am formed by his ways of thinking profoundly. I just don't put footnotes. I put one theologian or something like that instead. You know, I just don't quote it directly anymore, because I just don't think it's appropriate to put his name in a published document for a foreseeable future. But I can't renounce the formulations, nor I think is that actually necessary to do that. So I think that, well, I think the heart of your question at the moment isn't that third one; it's the second one, which is how can someone who's so good do something so bad? Mm-hmm. The power of self-deception knows no bounds. I think my only answer to that. I don't have an answer really. It's just desperately sad. Sad for them. Sad for everybody that's been affected by their behaviour. Sad for all of us who haven't been directly affected by their behaviour, but for whom it tarnishes everything we hold dear. I mean, this may seem pious, but and then I'll, you know, well, others welcome to say obviously anything they like. I just remember, it's probably an experience everyone here has had, but I do remember it causing me a lot of reflection. I remember the first time the person serving the chalice to me at communion poured it down my shirt. Probably all had an experience like that. And I think at that stage in my life, I was a bit more Anglo-Catholic than I am now. And, you know, I was thinking, well, you know, that shirt will have to go on the fire. Why I actually thought, and why other people think that somehow burning a nice bit of 100% cotton, well-ironed, was of service to the Lord. You know, it seems like a very obscure part of the Old Testament that would instruct something like that.
A whole burnt offering.
Yeah, exactly. Not quite sure how that redeems anything, but anyway, that was the kind of approach to the sacrament of the people that I was hanging out with in those days. And so I did give it a lot of reflection, because I found it very upsetting, until I reached the point in my reflection where I thought, that's what I do every day, shed the blood of Christ. And I don't go around burning those things or burning myself. I have to find some form of redemption, which is about changed life, but is also recognizing that even a changed life won't take the damage away.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that may seem a bit pious, but I am, I was when I responded to the Yoda thing in print, I was fighting between two poles really. One is, the anger, hurt, distress, disappointment, solidarity with the victim, all of that, which is, very powerful and more powerful in our society, and rightly so, than it was a generation ago. With the recognition that there can be a kind of glee in rushing to condemn somebody and call them evil, and it's what the newspapers do in the face of a child killer or something like that, and that just makes everyone feel better, because you say, I may be awful, but I'm not as bad as them.
Right.
And there's something rather self-serving about that. So I found it hard to balance those two things. I am a sinner, but this guy, gosh, I can't get my head around it. And the deception, I guess, because on a certain level, both of those people. Well, I think, I suppose that, and as even a fourth dimension, which is why I think the word evil isn't inappropriate, using the definition that I used in chapter 6, which is clearly both of these people spent most of their time with these women trying to pass off a story that this was a holy thing to be doing together. And that, that's another level again, I think. Sin is no one will find out, everybody does it, it'll only happen once. That's what sin says. It knows it's wrong, but it makes up a story to say that its wrongness is minor. Whereas evil says, no, this isn't wrong, this is beautiful and good and true,
Mm-hmm.
which tarnishes the words beautiful and good and true for a long time afterwards, and leaves the victim hopelessly confused in a way that I don't know if you'd ever get over, really. So, those they're not very satisfactory reflections, but I do think we need to talk about these things together.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's good. We can start bringing in some other conversations.